All right, y'all. I fell into a huge hole in my researching, and I need to get comfortable per normal. Let me scoot up a little and shake the whole world. All right, so yes, I have been researching all night long. I have been working on my generational, excuse me, generational videos breaking down generations astrologically and astrologically. God, I hope I hope I can get through this video. So anyway, anyways, I was going through researching. I did a video on the silent generation, and I started working on the baby boomers, 1946 through 1964. And so I totally reframed, not totally, but I have certainly outlined the format for that. And the silent generation was kind of like the intro into the series, or whatever you want to call it. There's going to be multiple videos. And so that was like a trial run, and I didn't, thought I could do much better. So I started reorganizing the format, the layout of the baby boomers, adding a whole bunch more information historically with dates and the 9 pillars of society. And so I was going through the information prior to even the astrological portion. And so I have 9 pillars. I was going through economy, war, global threat, politics and authority, education, religion and morality, technology and medicine, marriage and gender roles, music and culture and media. So I didn't get very far. I started adding more and researching more into the war portion. I'm scrolling down. So the war and global threat portion, I got through the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. And then I realized the Israel-Palestine war has actually started in 1948. Now, I cannot stand war. I absolutely cannot stand war. I didn't like history in school. I didn't enjoy learning about war. I am more of a biology, science, chemistry, English. I love those subjects and not history, because who writes history, who writes about it is the one that controls the narrative. And so I've always thought that way my entire life. And yes, I look exhausted because I've been up all night researching, and I've already filmed 3 hours of video. And so I went down a huge freaking rabbit hole with the Palestinian, what is going on. I don't watch much. I do not watch much new. I don't watch any mainstream. I've been this way for the past 2 decades. I don't watch mainstream stuff. I have been really in my own world with my business here, researching. I've written 30 books in the last few years. And so I've really been secluded in my own little world, focusing on that. And, being a mother and all of that. And so, yeah, I went down a huge rabbit hole, and I am seeing the parallel between Native Americans and Palestinians. So before I get too deep into this information, I need to do my disclaimers. And yeah, so I'm not sure how long this video is going to be. I'm going to add this video to my geopolitics series. I have 10, 11 series going on at once on my channel, so you never really know what you are going to get as the next video. I tend to hammer quite a few in one series and move on to the next. My ultimate goal was to do one video and then do another video for the next series. And it's just, I'm a creative human being and I need to be in a flow. And so you never really know what the next video is going to be about. So this video is the Israel-Palestine 1948 through present U.S. support in the trauma loop no one wants to name. So I want to say this clearly before we start. I need to brighten my screen and adjust some things. So give me one. Oh, it is the brightest as it gets. All right. So I want to say this clearly before we start. This is not a pick a side video. This is not a propaganda video. This is not a video where I'm going to flatten human beings into heroes or villains. My hair is crazy. And so are my eyes. I've got a space heater going and I've got contacts. And so my eyes are like dried out. So this is a video about history, power, and nervous systems. Because if you've watched what's happening, and I have the big bay door open, so you'll probably hear traffic flow. So this is a video about history, power, and nervous systems. Because if you've been watching what's happening and thinking, how is this still happening? How does this never end? Why does every ceasefire feel like a pause, not a solution? Why does it feel like the world is watching a trauma loop? You are not crazy. And I also want to make something else very clear. Criticizing a government policy is not hatred of a people. Grieving Jewish suffering is not the same thing as endorsing Israel state actions. Supporting Palestinian civilians is not the same thing as denying Israel's right to exist. Those false binaries are exactly how people get emotionally hijacked. So if you can hold complexity, stay with me. Because what I'm going to do is lay out why historians say 1948 to present. This actually blew my mind. I don't get into war and conflict, and so yes, call me behind or ignorant. That's fine. It's not my favorite topic. What the U.S. has actually supported, why this conflict is structurally hard to resolve, and why it hits the nervous system, especially Gen Z, so intensely. And then I'm going to connect it to a bigger pattern: displacement, empire logic, and intergenerational trauma. So this is going to be factual, human, and grounded. So let's start with the timeline. And I feel this so deeply. I've got many generations of Native American trauma, honestly, and that is where my heart and spirit is. And so it's very, very, very sad to... It really hits me in the body and the heart, and it's not an easy thing to acknowledge. It's awful in every direction. So, all right. So Palestine and Israel, why 1948 to present is accurate. So this is the timeline. Before 1948, the land we're talking about was not a modern nation state the way we think of countries today. It was part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries, pre-1917. Then after World War I, it became the British Mandate of Palestine, meaning Britain controlled it, 1917 through 1948. And during that time, Jewish and Arab populations lived there. But tensions rose, especially after World War II. Because the Holocaust was not just a tragedy, it was genocide, and Jewish survival was a real, urgent issue. Here's the part people don't say cleanly. Jewish safety was a real need that does not automatically justify displacing another people. Two truths can exist at the same time. And the collision of those truths is part of why this has stayed so explosive. I am extremely ignorant with what's going on. and that is why I'm doing this video. So 1947 through 1948, the rupture. Now we get to the rupture. In 1947, the United Nations proposed the partition plan, dividing the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. In 1948, Israel declared independence, and war followed. And during this period, around 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, expelled, or forced to flee, and many were never allowed to return. Palestinians called this the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. This is a foundational wound, because in this moment, one side became a recognized state with borders and international legitimacy growing over time, and the other side did not. There was never a clean, parallel creation of a Palestinian state that was protected and enforced the same way. So when historians say 1948 to present, they're pointing to this. The conflict begins with a founding rupture that never closed. As a small child, I used to watch Holocaust documentaries and just sit there and cry. Like, I was the child that would sit there and read dictionaries and yeah, I am very intellectual, but also extremely empathetic. So from 1948 through 1967, armistice, not peace. So during this period, Gaza was controlled by Egypt, which I had no clue. The West Bank was controlled by Jordan. Many Palestinians remained refugees or stateless. Borders were treated as temporary or unresolved. So the conflict was not healed. It was paused. And you can't build stability on pause. 1967, Six-Day War and Occupation Structure. So in 1967, the Six-Day War begins. Israel captured Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And this is where the modern occupation structure begins. And here's the key point. Those territories are internationally treated as occupied, not fully resolved sovereign land. So from here forward, the core issue becomes not just who lives where, but who has rights, who has movement, who has legal protection, who has control. All right, I'm going to have to get comfortable. My contacts are certainly driving me insane right now. It's 30 degrees or so. Very, very chilly in Indiana. All right, so 1970s through 1990s, cycles of violence, no final status. From the 1970s through the 1990s, you see uprisings, the intifadas. I don't really know what that is. Intifadas. You see military responses, you see peace attempts, and you see repeated failure to reach a final agreement. The problem is peace efforts focused on management, not resolution. Ceasefire, security, coordination, economic aid, temporary arrangements, but the founding wound, displacement, sovereignty, and border rights stayed unresolved. 2000s through 2010s, Gaza sealed and repeated wars. In the 2000s, Gaza becomes more sealed off. In 2007, Hamas takes control of Gaza. Israel, along with Egypt, imposes a blockade. And then you get repeated escalations and wars. 2008 through 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021. Each cycle follows the same pattern. It starts, civilians die, it ends, and the core structure remains untouched. That's what a trauma loop looks like. It's not one continuous hot war. It's a protracted conflict with repeated escalations because the underlying system never resolves. 2023 through the present, current escalation. From 2023 to now, we're in another massive escalation. Huge civilian casualties, a global moral crisis, and once again, no final political resolution. So when scholars say 1948 to present, the reasoning is simple. There has never been a final peace settlement. Palestinian statehood remains unresolved. Refugee status remains unresolved. Borders remain disputed, and the trauma is generational, not episodic. It's extremely sad, like sitting here and putting this into perspective. So the Israel-Palestine conflict began in 1948 and has never fully been resolved, resulting in repeated cycles of violence that span generations rather than a single war with an endpoint. Nervous system truth. For Palestinians, multiple generations born into displacement. No stable sense of home or safety. Trauma passed biologically and culturally. For the world, repeated exposure to civilian suffering, moral polarization, compassion fatigue, and disassociation. The U.S. role. Now let's talk about the United States. Because Americans feel exhausted and morally conflicted about this for a reason. Here's the short version. The U.S. has constantly supported Israel militarily, financially, and diplomatically, while providing Palestinians mainly humanitarian assistance without equivalent support for sovereignty. Now let's break that down. Diplomatic support. In 1948, the United States was the first country to recognize Israel, minutes after its declaration. That matters because it anchored Israel's legitimacy inside the global system immediately. Meanwhile, Palestinians did not receive an equivalent state framework in parallel. The second piece is the UN. The U.S. has repeatedly used its veto power to block United Nations UN resolutions critical of Israel. This includes ceasefire demands, investigations, and sanctions. The pattern becomes diplomatic shielding of Israel, pressure on Palestinians to negotiate without equal leverage. Military support. The U.S. is Israel's largest military backer. Over time, U.S. aid to Israel totals well over $150 billion, largely military since World War II. Under modern agreements, Israel receives billions per year, about $3.8 billion per year, in U.S. military assistance. So that is actually negotiated in contracts years out. That includes advanced weapon systems and missile defense like Iron Dome, fighter crafts, F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s, intelligence sharing, joint military exercises. So the U.S. does not fully control how weapons are used once transferred, but the support is real and it shapes the power balance. Strategic alliance Cold War logic. During Cold War, Israel becomes a stable U.S. ally in the Middle East, a counterbalance to Soviet influence. That's why the relationship persists across Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, multiple wars and peace processes. This is institutional, not personal. Economic and technological support. The U.S. also supports Israel via trade, technology partnerships, research and defense cooperation, intelligence collaboration. Israel is treated as a strategic partner, not just a recipient. What the U.S. supports for Palestinians. This is where people get confused. The U.S. does provide aid to Palestinians, but primarily humanitarian. Funding through UN agencies, food, health, education, emergency relief. But what the U.S. has not consistently supported is full recognition and enforcement of Palestinian sovereignty, military protection, equal diplomatic leverage, guaranteed borders, statehood enforcement. So the aid keeps people alive but doesn't create stability. Mediator but not neutral. The U.S. presents itself as a peace broker, but it is not neutral. It negotiates while being Israel's primary ally. That creates a power imbalance. One side negotiates with security guarantees, the other negotiates with survival uncertainty. And from a nervous system perspective, the asymmetry alone can prevent closure. This asymmetry is why the conflict cannot metabolize. One side has security guarantees, the other has survival uncertainty. The U.S. has consistently supported Israel as a strategic ally through military aid, diplomatic protection, and political partnership, while providing Palestinians primarily humanitarian assistance without equivalent support for sovereignty or statehood. So this does not mean all Americans support every Israel action. Criticism of policy does not equal hatred. Supporting Palestinian civilians does not exactly equal opposing Israel's right to exist. So those are false binaries, and my work dismantles binaries. Because this conflict isn't being fed by one problem, it's being sustained by multiple locked systems that all benefit from not resolving it, while the people living inside it pay the cost. So that is the clean structural truth, not ideology, not blame. All right, I'm going to take a quick coffee break. I need to get some sleep, but I'm going to try to power through this and do my boomer generation video. And then I have a 3-hour movie to attend with my daughter and father. I never go to the movie theater, but she wants to see a movie and it's 3 hours long. God help us all. I will try not to fall asleep. I am finally on break, and so I'm really hammering studies and videos and my series. So that is like my ultimate hammering goal. That is what I do for fun. All right, so why this doesn't resolve. Now we go into the part that makes people uncomfortable. Because this conflict isn't being sustained by one problem. It's being sustained by locked systems, and here are the main ones. All right, so I already mentioned that one. All right, so yeah, it's I already talked about the asymmetry. And then it's structurally useful to power actors. This is the part people avoid saying out loud. The conflict persists partly because it serves interests. I need to sit up a little bit more, and I feel like you can't hear me necessarily. Okay, there. Whew. I gotta sit up. I gotta stretch a little bit. All right. Okay. And you can see my breath because it's freezing outside. All right. It's structurally useful to power actors. And yes, I'm in a huge industrial shed and it's not heated. I always say that because I know you can see my dragon breath and you're probably wondering what the heck. All right. So this is the part people avoid saying out loud. The conflict persists partly because it serves interest for global powers. A strategic foothold in the Middle East. Arms sales justification is a huge one. Arms sales, pew pew. Weapons, leverage over regional politics, distraction from internal instability. For regional governments, a unifying external issue, a pressure valve for domestic unrest, a way to delay reform. For political leadership, fear consolidates power. Unresolved threat justifies emergency measures. Compromise risks backlash. Peace destabilizes entrenched power. War stabilizes it. Trauma cannot negotiate. This isn't poetic, it's neurological. Both populations carry trauma, but it manifests differently. One side carries existential fear, annihilation memory. The other side carries existential erasure, statelessness, invisibility, and displacement. Trauma produces hypervigilance, zero-sum thinking, moral absolutism, survival logic over relational logic. Traumatized nervous systems do not compromise, they react. The founding wound was never closed. 1947 through 1949. The conflict didn't start over time. It started unfinished. Borders were drawn without mutual consent. Displacement was treated as temporary. Statehood was unevenly implemented. Justice was deferred until later. Later never came. Unresolved founding wounds metastasized. They don't fade. Peace attempts avoided the core issues. Peace processes focused on security, borders, elections, ceasefires, and economic aid, but avoided right of return, sovereignty enforcement, accountability, dignity, repair, trauma acknowledgement. You can't resolve a conflict while refusing to name what hurts most. That isn't diplomacy, that's delay. Religion, sacralized territory. Once land becomes divinely promised, identity fused, spiritually defended, compromise becomes heresy. In sacred land, conflicts don't resolve through politics alone. They resolve when meaning shifts, and meaning has not shifted enough yet. I'm not going to go down that. I've done tons of research on that, and I'm going to leave it at that. It's a deep hole. Violence becomes the only language the system responds to. When diplomacy fails, institutions ignore and nonviolent resistance is suppressed. Violence becomes the only signal that breaks through. That does not make it moral. It makes it predictable. Now, here's the integration. You cannot end a trauma-based system with power-based solutions. Power creates control. Control creates resentment. Resentment creates violence. Until safety is mutual, dignity is enforced, sovereignty is real, accountability exists, and trauma is acknowledged, the system self-replicates. This conflict persists not because peace is impossible, but because the systems that profit from control are stronger than the mechanisms designed to heal trauma. So now I'm going to get into the indigenous mirror, because that is my lineage. That is my generational deep wound myself. So now I'm going to connect this to something deeper, because this is where many Americans feel a specific kind of grief in their body, the Native American and Palestinian parallels. And I need to be careful here. This is not saying Jewish people are Europeans. This is not denying Jewish trauma or history. This is not flattening anyone into a stereotype. This is about colonial mechanics. Two peoples, same structural position. Indigenous to the land. Native nations lived on and stewarded North America for thousands of years. Palestinians lived continuously in historic Palestine for centuries. Towns, villages, farms, family lines. Both are populations with deep roots, not abstractions. External power arrives and imposes rule. In North America, European settlement backed by empire. In Palestine, imperial mandate control, then partition and enforcement by external powers. And here's the key parallel. Neither people were the source of the trauma that displaced them. They became collateral to external crisis. Palestinian people belonged where they already are. They are indigenous to the land they have lived on for generations. This isn't a political statement, that is a historical and human one. The real issue isn't where they belong. It's why their belonging was never formally protected. What happened wasn't a natural migration or mutual separation. It was borders drawn by external powers, displacement treated as temporary, return deferred indefinitely, sovereignty applied unevenly. So Palestinians ended up in a condition no population can stabilize in. Present but not protected, native but not sovereign, rooted but legally precarious. That creates permanent instability, not coexistence. The question that keeps getting asked wrong. People keep asking, where should Palestinians go? That question in itself reveals the problem, because it assumes displacement is acceptable, removal is the solution, power decides belonging. In modern international law and basic human ethics, people are not required to leave their homeland to resolve a political failure. The unresolved core, what has never been fully answered or enforced, is equal rights, freedom of movement, legal protection, self-determination, dignity under the law. Until those exist, any arrangement remains unstable, whether one state, two states, confederation, or something new. Structures don't fail because people belong. They fail because rights are not symmetrical. Law reframes reality. Treaties were used and broken. Borders were drawn. Land was reclassified. Paper over presence. That's how displacement becomes legal. Forced displacement. Native nations were removed, marched, and confined. Palestinians were displaced, villages depopulated or destroyed, refugees created and held in that status across generations. I'm starting to get emotional. This is a very difficult reality for both. Displacement was not accidental. It was structural. Containment zones. Reservations, enclaves, checkpoints, restricted movement, controlled economies. Containment is not integration. Containment is management. Cultural suppression. Language suppressed, identity criminalized, narratives created that deny the people's legitimacy. And then resistance gets reframed as threat. Defense becomes savagery. Context gets erased. Fear becomes justification. Survival without repair. Native communities continue living with poverty, health crises, intergenerational trauma, and limited sovereignty. Palestinians continue living with statelessness, restricted movement, reoccurring violence, and humanitarian dependence without political closure. Here's the structural sentence. Both were asked to disappear so someone else could feel safe. Native Americans and Palestinians are not the same people, but they were placed in the same position, asked to disappear so someone else could feel safe. Indigenous peoples of the Americas experienced genocide, mass displacement, cultural erasure, forced assimilation, and land theft on a continental scale, and then were expected to disappear quietly. This is not an opinion, this is a historical fact. Why it feels so devastating when you really see it. Because unlike other genocides that ended with trials, reparations, global acknowledgement, memorialization, political restructuring, indigenous genocide was normalized as progress. There was no moment where the world said this was wrong, this must never happen again. Instead, it became the foundation of modern nations. That does something very specific to the nervous system. Grief without closure, loss without justice, survival without dignity. Which is why Native trauma often shows up as silence, humor, stoicism, or spiritual withdrawal. Not because it hurt less, but because there was no safe place to grieve. Yeah, it's disgusting. Europeans, genocidal Native Americans, Jews ending up on mass scale on land and pushing out other people. Yeah, I'm going to break that down more. Like, a few grounding truths just so your mind can hold what your heart already knows. Tens of millions of indigenous people lived in the Americas pre-colonization. Up to 90% were killed through disease, often intentionally spread or knowingly exploited, massacres, forced marches, starvation, cultural destruction. Children were taken, beaten for speaking their language, and taught to hate themselves. Land wasn't just taken, the relationship to land was severed. That last part matters the most. For indigenous cultures, land is not property. It's identity, spirituality, memory, and regulation. So this wasn't just genocide of people, it was genocide of world views. So I'm going to go into Native Americans a little bit deeper because it's very close to my heart and bloodlines. And then I will circle back around to what's going on currently. Why Native Americans never recovered. Not because they were weak, but because genocide didn't stop and then get acknowledged. It morphed into policy. This is very important to understand what happened to the Native Americans because it's happening to the Palestinians. And I see it. I see it for what it is. Genocide didn't stop and then get acknowledged. It morphed into policy and then into bureaucracy and then into silence. Recovery requires truth, land, voice, sovereignty, and continuity. Native peoples were denied all five. Instead, they were told, be grateful you survived. That one sentence alone can fracture a soul. So this hits me hard because I am indigenous, extremely spiritually sensitive, trauma literate, and embodied enough to feel intergenerational memory. And because I'm seeing a painful pattern, trauma that is unhealed doesn't disappear, it gets reenacted. Sometimes by the same group, sometimes by others, sometimes by systems. That doesn't mean everyone is the same. It means power without healing repeats itself. One thing that matters deeply, Native peoples didn't disappear, they endured. They adapted, they held wisdom underground. They protected relationship to earth when the world abandoned it. And now as systems collapse, that wisdom is being remembered. Not fast enough, not fairly, but it is happening. So now we're going to get back into the core sequence of the Israel-Palestinian issue at hand. All right. As a farm kid, I am constantly reminded of how absolutely grateful I am for my peace. I am always like, I love living in the country and working in the city. I need to retreat to my peace. It is kind of isolating. It is very lonely at times, but I am extremely grateful for peace. Certainly, I can study. I can study a lot. It's great. All right, so the core sequence, simplified and factual. The land already had people living on it. Before the 20th century, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in Palestine. Palestinians had towns, farms, schools, mosques, and churches. There was no modern nation state yet, but there was a population with deep roots. European anti-Semitism created a refugee crisis. I didn't even really know what anti-Semitism is. I just do not get into politics. I don't get into politics. I don't get into semantics. Like, it's not my jam. Not my jam. Jewish people faced horrific persecution in Europe. Pogroms, then the Holocaust. Many needed safety, urgently and legitimately. Zionism emerged as a movement for a Jewish homeland. Jewish safety was a real need that does not automatically justify displacing another people. Colonial powers made the decision. So don't forget that there were Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in Palestine. Palestine. All right, so colonial powers made the decision. After World War I and II, Britain controlled the region. The UN proposed partition in 1947. Palestinians were not meaningfully included in deciding their future. The plan gave a majority of land to a minority population at the time. This triggered war, mass displacement of Palestinians in 1948, Refugees were never allowed to return. This event is called the Nakba catastrophe. Forced replaced consent. Once Israel was established, borders expanded through wars, 1948 through 1967. Military occupation followed. Settlements expanded on occupied land. Palestinians lived under military law, restricted movement, and unequal rights. Land wasn't sold away peacefully, it was taken through war, law, and forced over decades. Why the conflict hasn't been squashed? Because you cannot bomb or police a population into peace when their land was taken, their movement is restricted, their rights are unequal, their displacement is unresolved. Peace requires justice and security for everyone, not just one side. Without that, violence cycles. Why the U.S. keeps backing Israel? This part explains the American frustration that I am feeling. The U.S. supports Israel because of Cold War strategy, Israel as a regional ally, military partnerships, political lobbying, religious ideologies inside U.S. politics, geopolitical power projection. It is not because Americans unanimously agree. Many Americans feel exhausted by endless foreign wars, morally conflicted, unheard by leadership, tired of their tax dollars funding destruction. That tension you feel, you're not alone. Modern Israel exists on land that was historically called Palestine, where Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, and Christians had been living for generations, alongside smaller Jewish communities. After 1948, Israel became a state on that land, and many Palestinians were displaced and never allowed to return. That is the core reality. And I am ashamed to admit I had absolutely no clue what was actually going on. And that is sad. But yes. Slightly more precise because history is layered. So before 1948, the region was known as Palestine. So I already said all this. I'm not going to repeat it. Make sure I didn't miss anything. All right, so what exists today? Palestine is not a fully sovereign country. Palestinians live mainly in Gaza, the West Bank. These are militarily controlled or heavily restricted by Israel. So why this is so confusing for Americans? Because most Americans were taught Israel was created after the Holocaust, which is true, but not who already lived there, what happened to them, why the conflict never ended. Both truths exist at the same time. Jewish people needed safety. Palestinians lost their homeland. History chose one safety over another. So I hope I don't get a strike on my channel, but so the reason why the Jewish people, ran to Palestine is because of European anti-Semitism, which culminated into genocide. The immediate threat, Nazi Germany in 1933 through 1945, systemic persecution and extermination of Jews. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Jews were stripped of rights, property, citizenship, and life. But this didn't come out of nowhere. Anti-Semitism existed long before Hitler. For centuries, Jews in Europe faced forced segregation, ghettos, expulsions, Spain, 1492, England earlier, and parts of Eastern Europe. Pogroms, violent massacres, especially in Russia and Eastern Europe. Religious persecution by Christian institutions, being blamed for economic crisis, plagues, and wars. By the early 1900s, Jews were stateless in practice. Many countries would not accept Jewish refugees. Anti-Semitism was normalized. After World War II, nowhere to go. This part is crucial. After 1945, Europe was devastated. Jewish survivors had no homes to return to. Families were gone, properties were seized. Many countries refused immigration quotas. Even the United States turned away Jewish refugees before and during the war. maintained strict immigration limits. So Jewish survivors were traumatized, displaced, unwanted, and still unsafe in Europe. Why Palestine became the destination. Not because Palestinians caused the Holocaust, they didn't, but because Britain controlled Palestine after World War I. Zionism, Jewish homeland movement already existed. Western powers wanted a solution outside Europe. Palestine was treated as valuable land by colonial logic. This is the hard truth. Europe committed the crime, and Palestinians paid the cost. Two traumas collided. This is why the conflict is so emotionally explosive. You have Jewish trauma through genocide, exile, and existential fear, and Palestinian trauma, displacement, loss of land, ongoing occupation. Both are real. Both are unresolved, but they were never equal in power. One side gained a state, the other side lost one. Jewish people were running from genocide, but Palestinians weren't the ones committing it. So what anti-Semitism actually is, because I honestly had no idea. I'm in my own little world in the country. I am more focused on, I don't know, I just don't get into, I just wasn't raised this way. I have a Native American spirit and heart and soul. I just think it's complete ignorance to kill people and be in continuous wars. It's greed. It's hate. I just can't stand it. So this is definitely a difficult video for me, but it's also very educational, and it's important to understand these things in this day and age. So, all right, so what is anti-Semitism? It is prejudice, hatred, or conspiracy thinking directed at Jewish people because they are Jewish. It is not criticism of Israel. It is not disagreement with policy. It is not questioning power. It is blaming Jews as a group for economic problems, claiming Jews secretly control governments, banks, or media, treating Jewish people as a monolith instead of individuals, punishing Jews collectively for actions of a state or leaders. My Catholic uncle married a Jewish woman that is extremely into the daily, practice, very Jewish. I mean, my family, I just don't get any of this. I actually don't get it. That's why I have to actually study it and go through this process, because it literally does not make sense to me. So why is it so dangerous? It historically escalates from words, exclusion, violence, and genocide. It's been used repeatedly as a scapegoat mechanism in collapsing societies. So when people say anti-Semitism, at its core, they mean don't turn real political problems into ethical blame. That warning exists for a reason. History proved what happens when that line gets crossed. Do Jewish people have the U.S. government gridlocked? Is a huge question. I'm seeing it all over the internet. So this is where truth and distortion gets mixed and confusion explodes. So what's true? American Israel Public Affairs and similar groups are very powerful lobbying organizations. The U.S. government has strong institutional support for Israel. U.S. politicians face career consequences for opposing Israel military aid. The U.S. often vetoes UN resolutions critical of Israel. What is not true? Jewish people as a group do not control the United States government. Jewish Americans are not politically unified. Many Jewish people actively oppose Israel policies. Power operates through institutions, money, and empire, not ethnicity. The accurate frame is a U.S. geopolitical alliance plus military industrial interests plus lobbying power is the Jewish control in America. So when that distinction gets lost, anti-Semitism creeps in. So now the pattern. Yeah, okay. So this is the pattern that I locked in. Displacement, colonization, and empire logic. So I certainly made this connection. Europeans displaced Native Americans. Europeans displaced Palestinians. The genocides that they have... Europeans exported their trauma outward. That's not coincidence. I cannot even fathom. Like, these are not even human beings. I can't. It's really, really hard for me to wrap my mind around all of this. It really, truly is. It's these people are not human beings at all to me. All right. So why Europeans keep displacing people? The real answer. I'm gonna take a quick drink. I am maybe almost done. I'm not sure how many pages I ended up with. Okay. This is a really, really difficult topic for myself. All right. I'm all about the spiritual, psychological, emotional integration realms. This is the total opposite realm. Empire survival strategy. From 1500 onward, European powers developed a model. Extract resources, expand territory, dehumanize locals, justify it morally through religion and civilization and their own security, normalize displacement. This happened to Native Americans, Africans through slavery, Indigenous Australians, South Asians, Middle Eastern populations, Caribbean populations, and Palestinians. Different places, same logic. Trauma export, the part nobody wants to admit. Europe didn't just export people, it exported unresolved trauma. After World War II, Europe committed genocide. Europe refused to fully absorb survivors. Europe helped relocate Jewish people elsewhere. Another population paid the price. This isn't Jewish evil, this is imperial cowardice. The same system that displaced Native Americans also displaced Palestinians and then called it progress or security. Why the United States feels complicit? Because it is. The U.S. is a settler colonial state built on indigenous displacement, deeply aligned with Israel, militarily invested in the Middle East, uncomfortable confronting its own origin story. That's why Americans feel this deep moral fatigue right now. Your nervous system is reacting to, we keep funding the same story, just with new victims. The clean distinction that saves your sanity. Jewish people, the Israel state, U.S. empire, moral authority, criticizing power, hating a people. You're allowed to grieve Jewish suffering, oppose Palestinian displacement, reject war, question U.S. priorities, and refuse ethnic blame. It's not anti-Semitism, that is moral clarity. Why this is hitting so hard emotionally. So why this is a really rough topic. So it hits me emotionally extremely hard because I see patterns instead of propaganda. I see systems instead of villains necessarily. You can never really see the villains, they're hidden, right? Trauma recycling itself across generations. People who feel deeply often struggle most with war because war requires dehumanization, and I see humans instead. So that's not weakness, it's called having a conscience. So why Europe was powerful enough to do this and keep doing it. This didn't happen because Europeans were smarter or better. It happened because three forces aligned early and compounded for 500 years. Europe industrialized war first and never stopped. Europe cracked a brutal equation earlier than anyone else. Science plus steel plus ships plus finance equals dominance. By the 1500s through the 1800s, gunpowder warfare, naval supremacy, fortification science, bureaucratic armies, standing militaries, not seasonal fighters. Once that system exists, it feeds itself. Europe didn't win because of morality. It won because it scaled violence. Europe was a business model, not an accident. European empires weren't just nations, they were corporate systems. Does that sound familiar? Key features: colonies equals resource extraction zones, indigenous people equals labor or obstacles, borders equals tools, not truce, religion and civilization equals moral cover. This model funded banks, universities, armies, political stability back home. So empire was not optional, it was structural survival. Europe exported trauma instead of healing it. This part is rarely said out loud. Europe went through centuries of religious wars, feudal brutality, plague, class violence, genocides, 2 world wars, and the Holocaust. Instead of metabolizing trauma internally, Europe externalized conflict, relocated problems, and moved violence outward. Displacement becomes a pressure valve. That's why the same patterns repeat. Native Americans, Africans, Palestinians, Indigenous Australians, and South Asians. Different victims, save unresolved system. After World War II, power didn't disappear, it changed uniforms. After 1945, Europe was physically weakened, but its system survived. Power transferred to its former colonies, especially the United States. The U.S. inherited empire logistics, military doctrine, financial dominance, and geopolitical control. So when people say Europe did this, the honest version is Europe built the systems, the U.S. now maintains it. Why this keeps happening to multiple countries? Because empire logic runs on scarcity and fear. Core rules of empire: someone must be expendable, borders must be flexible for power, not people. Security justifies cruelty, the center must stay comfortable. Peace threatens empire, war sustains it. So are there real answers to peace? I'm gonna adjust myself. Oh yeah, I've been sitting here for hours on end. Ugh. Researching like an absolute madwoman. All right. So yes, peace is I don't know. Are there real answers to peace? That is the ultimate question us spiritual people are asking. Yes, but they require dismantling systems, not just treaties. Here are the only approaches that have ever worked. Truth before reconciliation. No shortcuts. Peace does not come from pretending history didn't happen, moving on, suppressing grief. It comes from naming displacement, acknowledging harm, ending denial. This is why so many conflicts stall. Truth destabilizes power. Equal humanity must replace security hierarchies. As long as one group's safety is valued over another's existence, peace is impossible. Peace requires equal legal status, equal movement, equal dignity, and equal grief. Not dominance, not revenge, not silence. Borders must stop being weapons. Most modern conflicts are border inventions. Most modern conflicts are border inventions, not ancient hatred. Peace requires shared land models, federated governance, economic cooperation, and local autonomy. This threatens centralized power, which is why it is resisted. Trauma must be treated as real, not symbolic. Unprocessed trauma becomes ideology. Peace requires grief rituals, intergenerational healing, psychological repair, nervous system regulation at scale. This is slow, and empires prefer fast control. The world must choose people over systems. This is the hardest truth. Peace is possible only if systems are allowed to fail. I have very mixed feelings with that. I will break that down later, but not now. I'm exhausted. Empires survive by sacrificing humans. Peace survives by sacrificing power. There is certainly a balance, a better balance in what is going on now. I will put it that way. I'm not a burn it all down person by any stretch of the imagination. There's just better ways. Because, so, why this feels so unbearable to understand. So when you're not disassociating, it feels very unbearable to understand. Most people cope with war by picking sides, simplifying villains, numbing out. So when you actually see systems, see people as human beings just like yourself, refusing dehumanization, it's exhausting. It's certainly exhausting. But truth matters, certainly. You need an overarching view of what's going on. Bird's eye view. All right, so integration, grief, and why this is surfacing now. Now let's talk about why this hits the nervous system so hard and why it feels like the world is waking up into grief. Grief is not weakness. Grief is what happens when truth finally has enough safety to surface. For Palestinians, multiple generations have been born into displacement. Not stable sense of home, no stable sense of safety. Trauma carried biologically and culturally. For the rest of the world, repeated exposure to civilian suffering, moral polarization, compassion fatigue, and disassociation. So we are seeing a trauma loop that never closed. And we are starting to refuse to numb out. And in a bigger cultural shift, people are losing trust in institutions. Authority is decentralizing, and when authority decentralizes, suppressed truths rise. Bubbling up. This is the Aquarian age. Truth shall bubble up and explode out into fireworks so everyone can see. So that includes grief. That includes indigenous memory. That includes the pattern of empire solving its crisis by moving the cost onto other people. And here's the grounding truth I want to leave you with. You are not responsible for fixing history. You're responsible for not becoming numb or cruel. Peace doesn't begin when everyone agrees. Peace begins when we stop asking people to disappear. So if you made it this far, thank you for holding complexity. If you want in the next video, we can talk about how to stay compassionate without burning out, how propaganda hijacks the nervous system, and what people can do ethically without collapsing into hopelessness. So this is my geopolitical series. I'm certainly going to continue on. I have talked about a lot so far. I feel like there's so much more to talk about. I'm getting into topics that are uncomfortable for me, but very important in the overall understanding of a new age. We must look at these systems in order to hopefully correct what needs to be corrected. So I was going to end it there, but I want to end it with Native American indigenous wisdom, of course. So it's a beautiful thing. I've done some crying tonight, if you can't tell, and this heater is frying my eyeballs. After I have such big eyes that like I'm totally blind. It totally sucks. Big beautiful eyes are not good for actually seeing through them. They're cool to look at. That's about it. So yeah, I've got the big indigenous hazel eyes. My eyes are actually hazel, but my mother's side of the family, the native side, had huge eyes. All right, so indigenous wisdom never disappeared. It went dormant. So this is the rise of indigenous embodiment. Colonial systems didn't erase indigenous knowledge because it was weak. They suppressed it because it worked too well. Indigenous frameworks threatened systems built on extraction, hierarchy, separation from land, endless growth, domination over cooperation. So what happened wasn't extinction, it was containment. Reframing here. Knowledge went into oral traditions, ceremony, foodways, body memory, land stewardship practices, storytelling, nervous systems, and family lines like mine. This is why many indigenous descendants remember things they were never taught. It really hits me sometimes in waves. That remembering is not symbolic, it's biological and ancestral. Why it is resurfacing now. There are 3 global collapses happening at once. Ecological collapse, soil depletion, water crisis, species extinction. Modern systems don't know how to respond because they treat Earth as a resource. Indigenous systems treat Earth as a living relative. That difference is everything. Nervous system collapse, burnout, anxiety, depression, disassociation, and addiction. Western frameworks treat these as individual failures. Indigenous frameworks recognize them as systems of being disconnected from land, rhythm, and relational belonging. That's why somatic, ritual-based, nature-centered healing is resurging. Institutional collapse. Loss of trust in governments, corporate capture, war fatigue, and moral disorientation. People no longer believe authority equals wisdom. Indigenous governance models emphasize consensus, elders, accountability to future generations, decisions made with land in mind. These models are suddenly being studied seriously, not romantically. Where indigenous wisdom is visibly reemerging. I have to leave this video off with hope because it's true. You just have to know how to find it and look for it and embody it. Land stewardship and ecology. Controlled burns, long used by native peoples, and also my farming father's side of the family also use controlled burns. I'm laughing because that's also a very farmer thing to do. I totally am a pyro, and that's another reason why I'm laughing. So controlled burns, long used by native peoples, are now recognized as essential to prevent mega fires. Regenerative agriculture mirrors indigenous farming practices. Rewilding is essentially indigenous land relationship reframed in scientific language. And it's funny because my farming family, both sides, believed in these practices and continue to do them. So the irony, modern science is validating what was already known, which I've already known my entire life, but it needs to be spoken on for those who are not in the know. Semantic and trauma healing, body-based healing, breath work, movement rituals, grief ceremonies, plant medicine traditions with growing ethical scrutiny. Indigenous systems never separated body, emotion, spirit, and environment. The nervous system was always central. That's why Western therapy alone often feels incomplete. Ceremony and ritual returning. People are reclaiming seasonal rituals, ancestral honoring, fire ceremonies, or if you're like a farm kid like me, you absolutely love huge bonfires for fun. My Vesta is in Sagittarius in the 9th house, and that is my internal flame of devotion. It's my sacred fire inside of myself. I have my Vesta in Sag and my Sirius in Aries. And so yes, the sacred fire of the indigenous, tending to the fire. So, fire ceremonies, drum circles, grief rituals, rites of passage, not as cosplay, but because modern life has no containers for transition. There is no initiation rites, rites of passage. Indigenous cultures always did. Decolonizing psychology and education. You're seeing trauma theory intersect with ancestral memory, semantic psychology acknowledging historical trauma, educators questioning linear productivity models, and land acknowledgments evolving into land return discussions. This isn't performative anymore, it's becoming structural. Why Indigenous wisdom can't be copied. This part matters deeply. Indigenous wisdom is not a set of techniques, it's relational worldview. It requires humility, reciprocity, listening, time, place based knowledge, and accountability. That's why appropriation feels hollow, and why true reemergence looks slow, grounded, and often led by Indigenous people themselves. The wisdom doesn't want domination, it wants relationship. The role of Indigenous descendants like myself. This is important and very personal. I am not here to fix the world, prove anything, or carry anyone's grief alone. I am here to remember and translate. Bridging systems like science, spirituality, psychology, and history. That has been my tagline since the very beginning. Bridging science with spirituality. Feeling ahead of time, but exhausted. Sensing cycles and patterns instinctively. And grieving deeply for what was lost and feel hope for what returns. That's not coincidence. That's lineage expressing itself in a modern body. So, what reemergence actually looks like, not utopia. Indigenous wisdom returning does not mean rejecting technology, going backwards, idealizing the past, or dissolving structure entirely. It means grounding system in Earth's limits, valuing rest, rhythm, and regeneration, honoring elders and children equally, designing economies around care, not extraction, understanding that power is temporary and relational. This is why it aligns so strongly with semantic healing, nervous system regulation, decentralization, community based models, and planetary stewardship. The quiet truth. Indigenous wisdom is not reemerging because it's trendy. It's reemerging because the world cannot survive without it. And Indigenous peoples are not being asked to save the world, they're being remembered by it. So, this is why grief is showing up everywhere at once, and why it's not regression, weakness, or collapse. It's activation. So, I am done. I think I have a whole section on grieving. I am absolutely exhausted. Totally exhausted. All right, so I am going to talk about grieving because I don't know anyone that does. So I'm here. I'm here doing it, like I always say. Oh, I accept. Challenge accepted. All right, let me take a drink. I've recorded 4 hours of video today, and I'm not going to tell you how many hours I put into researching and typing. You don't need to know. Okay, so Indigenous grief was never individual. It was a communal and ecological. Oh, I thought that was a vehicle driving by. Something's vibrating all weird. All right, so indigenous frameworks. Grief was expressed publicly. Land participated, fire, water, soil, and sky. Time was not rushed. Elders guided the process. Grief restored balance. Colonial systems eliminated grief rituals because grief disrupts obedience. Grief dissolves false authority. Grief rehumanizes people. Grief reconnects people to the land and truth. Society without grief rituals becomes disassociated, violent, extractive, and spiritually hollow. Does that sound familiar? Why grief feels global right now. People are grieving ancestors they never met, land they never lived on, languages they never spoke, futures that were promised but never arrived, versions of themselves that were never allowed to exist. That's because grief is crossing time layers, not just personal memory. This is ancestral memory thawing, and thawing hurts. Grief is a gateway back into the body. I need this just as much as anyone because I have a very hard time with grief until 2025. This whole year has been an insane grieving, ancestral trauma healing ritual the entire year. I just cried 20 minutes earlier. Because I was looking into my native grandfather's birth chart, and I was doing my generational video, and I just miss him so much. I miss him so much. The most peaceful human being, and just being around him, he just embodied angelic love, the masculine that I don't see besides my own father and my grandfather, like, and my uncle. As it, the masculine embodied by a Native American man is, it just makes you weep when you miss it because it's not very common. It's not masculine. It's not performative. It's real. It's very real. It's not about drama. It's not about ego. Okay, back on topic here. So disassociation was adaptive. Grief is embodiment returning. When grief surfaces, the nervous system exits the freeze mode. Sensation returns, tears restore parasympathetic flow. Truth becomes tolerable again. That's why grief often arrives alongside exhaustion, crying for no reason, sudden clarity, a sense of sacredness, and feeling raw but alive. This is not breakdown, this is re-entry. Oh, wow. I don't know if I want to break this down here, but if you've made it this far, I think it's safe to say. Let me repeat this line, and I'm going to say a very, very brief thing. So, grief is the gateway back into the body. I'm seeing this paralleled with a real experience I had. Disassociation was adaptive. Grief is embodiment returning. So it is not breakdown, it is re-entry. Now, I've been through an extremely traumatic experience when I was 4 years old. And for my entire life up until this year. Now, if you believe it, I don't care. But my experience was, I'm not going to break it down in detail, but I had an extremely traumatic experience. So much so, I had an outer body soul experience. I literally lifted up out of my body into my soul. I was attached by a cord. I was going to make a whole video about this, and I need to sit down and really truly like figure out how to, it's hard to explain in words. So I had an outer body soul experience, and during the trauma, it turned away. It was like I was inside of this, and so I was no longer inside of my body, and I could not experience the trauma, and the soul turned away. I had no control over it. I could just see through it. I could not only see through the soul, I could see my own body outside of the soul. And when the soul turned, I like went into it and turned away from my own body. I never knew how to integrate that experience. And I always kind of I knew that it was buffering the trauma so I didn't embody it. It didn't imprint on me. It was protecting me. But they actually call that a walk-in, a soul walk-in. Your soul it's so insane. Like, it's unbelievable. It's like it's called like a soul walk-in. So it is your soul waking up immediately and remembering. It's not something that you experience until normally the end of your life. And I experienced it at 4 years old. And so for my entire life since then, I've known for a fact that I have a soul. And I have, see, I need to break this down in its own video, because it's like I have dual perception. Like, I know that I have a soul. I know that I'm not just my thoughts, but I can also see outside of myself. It's a very wild dual perception. I can't, the terms escape me. But this parallels with this grief, because I thought that that was like a total breakdown. And in all reality, it was a re-entry. My soul entering, buffering the trauma, protecting me, and then re-entering my body. And I was totally conscious at that point. And it it really does parallel with grief, like, and crying. I've had such a hard experience all the way up until this year. I really started working on my Native American my phone's gonna die. On my Native American healing. I've studied the genealogy. I've gone through tons of pictures. I've reconnected with my family. And I have processed through actual grieving tears. Like, I've always prided myself on not crying because it's strong. And I never was taught that crying isn't weak, if you know what I'm saying. And so crying is not a breakdown. It is a re-entry. Sorry, I side tangent, but reframing is everything. Is everything. I just bawled and bawled and bawled when I figured, like, I was just researching and studying, and that smacked me like a ton of bricks, because I was like, oh my God, you know, when you go through trauma, you can get into this, like, the psychology is like you can have like split personalities, or you can compartmentalize. It's kind of like a schizoid. I don't know what the terms are, but that can happen. That can happen. But in that moment, I made a promise to myself at 4 years old, after my soul re-entered my body. My promise to myself, but it was actually to my soul: I will never be what happens to me. At 4 years old, I will never be what happens to me, was the promise that I made to my soul. Yes, and it has been a fiery, it's a very fiery, my spirits are very fiery and trailblazing. It's like the Aries, Archangel Michael. I align with that energy a lot. Protecting children, protecting the underdogs. Anyways, so that's just a way to reframe grief, because believe me, I've spent my entire life not crying, and I feel more integrated than ever, to be honest. So why this is happening in the Aquarian age. Decentralization phase. Now let's map this cleanly. I am almost done. Hopefully my phone doesn't die. So, the Aquarian shift is not about tech or utopia. This is about where authority lives. Old paradigm is the Pisces Capricorn era or Capricorn Piscean era. Authority lived in institutions, churches, governments, empires, corporations, and hierarchies and experts. Truth was centralized, mediated, controlled, delayed, sanitized. Grief had no place here. It threatened the structure. Aquarian paradigm equals decentralization of authority. Authority moves into lived experience, embodied truth, nervous systems, communities, peer networks, land based wisdom, and distributed intelligence. Truth becomes experiential, plural, semantic, relational, and decentralized. This is why indigenous wisdom fits Aquarian energy perfectly. Indigenous systems are non hierarchical, place based, consensus oriented, relational, cyclical, accountable to future generations. Aquarius doesn't want control, it wants coherence. Why grief is required for decentralization. You cannot decentralize authority without dismantling false narratives, grieving broken promises, mourning stolen futures, releasing loyalty to harmful systems. Grief dissolves allegiance to illusion. Without grief, people cling to authority, repeat abuse, defend collapsing systems, seek false certainty. With grief, people reclaim discernment, stop outsourcing truth, listen inwardly, and reconnect to land and body. Grief is how authority returns to the self. Indigenous wisdom, Aquarian decentralization equals relational POW. Indigenous wisdom, knowledge held in community. Aquarian age, knowledge distributed across networks. Indigenous wisdom, elders as guides. Aquarian age, lived experience as authority. Land as teacher, systems ecology. Cyclical time, non-linear progress. Ceremony and integrated rituals. Accountability to future generations and sustainability. Grief is the bridge between the old world and the new one. You cannot skip it. Why this feels intense, messy, and unscripted. Because decentralization has no single leader, no clean timeline, no authority to defer to. Grief teaches tolerance for uncertainty, humility, listening, slowness, and relational repair. These are anti-empire skills. That's why grief looks like chaos to collapsing systems, but coherence to emerging ones. The quiet truth in this matters, and this is the end of this video. Indigenous wisdom isn't coming back as a trend. It's being remembered as humanity's nervous system. As humanity's nervous system re-enters the body of Earth. Grief is not a failure of the Aquarian age. It is the initiation rite. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This is an extremely difficult, very difficult topic for myself. I cannot stand war. I mean, I don't look at people through their own name. I look at people through their energy, their essence, their spirit, their emotions, their thinking patterns. Like, I am just not a normal type of person in general. And so I am living in an entirely different world, and I have been this way my entire life. And yes, but we have to ground ourselves in reality. So anyway, I hope you liked this video. Certainly feel free to leave your comments on your thoughts and feelings, and please like and subscribe. I deeply appreciate your support, and I will see you in the next video.